Hello and welcome everyone to this beautiful Friday. And we have a tremendously important thing coming up today, not just for Pioneer Lands, but for the entire world and for the space industry. We have the launch attempt of version 3 of Starship, the all-decisive new system, version 3 of SpaceX. Of course, SpaceX has an IPO and coming up, and I want to go a little deeper into the quantitative model we are working on. Just one little aspect of this huge model that is coming very soon to Pioneer Lands about SpaceX, the space industry, orbital AI, and everything that is a function of that. So what is going on? They delayed the launch. You can read it here. Elon himself tweeted yesterday and reported the hydraulic pin holding the tower arm in place did not retract. If that can be fixed tonight, there will be another launch attempt tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. I think CT. And that was tweeted out yesterday, of course. So today we are looking at 5:30 p.m. CT, or maybe even AM, I don't even know, that we will attempt that launch again. And why is that so important? Why is it so important for the stock, the IPO of SpaceX, potentially even for Tesla? And why do we care so much about that? So I want to dive a little deeper into a first quantitative model to explain why this is so important. A lot of people think, and here is just a glimpse of it, a lot of people think that we have the problem, the situation, that everything is about reusability. If you look at this all decisive number here, focus on this. This is a per 10 production. Just quick summary here. This number is the decisive number for the entire future of space. How much does it cost to bring a kilogram of mass to orbit into space? So you have 1 kilogram, a package, and you want to send it to space. How much does it cost? And the disruptive thing here is that we see with the system, with Starship, is that this price from currently $2,500 to $5,000 per kilogram with SpaceX Falcon systems, the current launch system that everyone has to use, which is SpaceX's Falcon system, Falcon Heavy, and that is between $2,500 and $4,000, depending how you count. And what Starship promises is to bring that dramatically down, okay? And this is a function, and that's what everyone is assuming, of the booster and the Starship. So the cost of these plus the actual launch costs. So when you look at this, just to explain this very, very quickly, what that actually means. If you go to these beautiful shots of this amazing vehicle, I think this is actually the one that we are looking at right now for today. This is the live shot, not the live, but yesterday. So this thing down here is the booster. The booster is the system that it carries, that lifts most of the heavy load, most of the heavy mission load goes into the booster. The booster's job is to carry this thing to a critical height. I'm not a space mega astronaut genius, so I don't understand exactly how high this has to carry, but the vast load of the carrying goes into the booster. So the booster has to lift the Starship that sits on top of the booster with the Merlin engines, I think, in here, has to lift it to a critical height, then disconnects. This thing disconnects and shoots the Starship to space. So once it disconnects, Starship takes over, uses its tiny little engines to do the rest and go into orbit. And as you probably know, the physics of space launches is very simple. You have an absolutely exponential problem the closer you get to the Earth's surface, because the gravity is much higher because of this geometric formula, right? The closer you're to the mass, the exponentially higher the gravity is. So right on Earth, it's the highest. Then you have to lift it up, and you basically have 90% of the job done. Not when you are 90% to where you want to go, but 90% is used of the energy to lift you probably half or whatever, or even less than half of the actual distance. So that is why this booster is so important. It's a different system. It's a different piece of the puzzle. And that booster basically has to do the heavy lifting, literally. And the Starship is then what actually goes to space, to the moon, wherever, going from orbit, from these 120 kilometers. Don't blame me if I get it all wrong. I think 100 kilometers is like low Earth orbit or something, and 120 is orbit, whatever, something like that. 60 miles straight up. and you are in suborbital space. And don't nail me on these numbers, but roughly there, right? If you're going 400 kilometers up, you're definitely like up there. And the critical boundary is somewhere around 120 kilometers, I think 60 miles straight up. That is where all the heavy lifting has to occur. And that is the job of the booster. So these boosters are developed, in kind of parallel or separately from the Starship. Very different job. The booster always stays in the atmosphere. Very important. Just shoots it up, critical mass, disconnects, shoots Starship up. Starship then takes over with much smaller engines, much less fuel. So this is all fuel and energy in the booster, whereas this is mostly cargo and a tiny little bit of fuel, right? So this is the genius of this launch system, that you have basically these reusable boosters. You've probably seen the chopstick situation. The chopsticks catch the boosters and the Starship goes to space. Now, the cost equation is very simple. If you build this entire system and have it one-time use only, then you pay for the entire system. If the system costs you $120 million, for example, let's say, 80 million for the booster and 40 million for Starship. We will look at the numbers in a second. Then you use it once, then each flight to orbit costs you 120 million just on the materials. But if you use it 100 times, suddenly the costs go down from 120 million to 1.2 million. Not accounting for refurbishing costs, but just on the simple, back of the napkin math. So you understand, if you don't reuse the system, it costs you 120 million in materials. If you reuse both pieces of the system 100 times instead of $120 million, you're only spending $1.2 million. That is why this is so important. And what SpaceX has not achieved yet is the reusability of Starship. What it has achieved is reusability of the booster. Not reliably, but they're there. They use the chopsticks. Chopsticks are very important as opposed to the booster landing on the ground, because if it lands on the chopsticks, on the giant Mechazilla tower that catches this, then you can refurbish and get it back to launch right away. If you land on the ground, it's a giant operation to get this giant skyscraper-sized thing actually back to the launch pad. So catching it directly over the launch pad with these Mechazilla arms is actually a total game changer. And so that's why it's so important they did that. So now we are looking at the challenge of getting Starship reused. Why is this so much more difficult than the booster? Because the booster only stays in the atmosphere and comes down, which means the booster is undergoing much less pressure and heat than Starship. Because if you only go 60 miles up or something like that, and then come back down to Earth, you're not getting very fast. Yeah? It's probably the speed of sound, maybe twice the speed of sound if you get unlucky. Somewhere around that. It's above the speed of sound at highest speed, but not much above. Don't nail me on the details. Maybe triple the speed of sound. I don't think so. But I think you hear the sound barrier. So it is definitely the speed of sound, the speed at that it comes down, the booster, but not much more. And that means there's no heat problem. It's just like a plane, right? No big heat problem. Hey, on this channel, we do something very important. We deeply analyze, understand, and predict capital, AGI, and politics. Not just to beat the markets and make a lot of money, even though that's important, but also to build a new society and make the future good for all of us, the pioneers. If you want to help me on this journey, you can do that by doing a very simple thing. Like and subscribe. It helps me a lot. Thank you so much for your support, and let's get back to the video. But if Starship, that goes actually into space in orbit, re-enters the atmosphere, you're talking about completely different dimensions of speed. Again, I don't know the details. You can figure that out with AI in a millisecond. Important things, I think it's 27 Mach or something. So you're talking about 27 times the speed of sound, 30 times the speed of sound. Because once you're up in space, you're just getting very fast relative to Earth without even noticing. So it's like, that's the problem. And that means when these things re-enter, satellites, asteroids, anything that went into deep space or orbit, wants to come back into the atmosphere, you're talking about absolutely exponential amounts of heat and pressure on this thing. And that is why it's a very different ballgame to make Starship actually be reusable, because in doing so, you need to have heat shields. You need to have massive physics problems solved that you do not need to solve with a booster. The booster needed to solve a bunch of calibration systems and needed to land exactly where you want to, so it's not trivial, but you don't have that heat problem and this immense, insane pressure problem. I remember when I was in DC and saw for the first time the Apollo capsule that came back. It's insane. You have these ceramic heat shields of the original Apollo capsule, and you see that they're actually molten. The ceramic molten and then frozen thing. You see how it like goes across the capsule. So it's getting very hot if you can melt ceramics. Okay, that is the situation, but let's go back to the model and make this very quick. We did a little physics and space excursion here for beginners, but here's the thing that people get wrong. Let's get to the important part, which is the economics. So that is the simple math that most people think, right? You have basically here these two inputs, very important. What is the reuse or use number? It's actually not reuse, it's the use number, because if you don't reuse it, you have to put a 1 in here for one flight. It's basically, let's rename this number of flights, right? So how many flights does each thing have? That's the big question. So if you don't have reuse, you only fly it up once, it's 1. If you have reuse, you know, it's the number of flights per unit. So as you can see, if you assume you reuse the booster 10 times, here's the exact cost structure for production of 10. So if you produce 10, it's a little more expensive than if you produce 100 of them. They will produce probably 100 in 2027 and 28 of these systems. And they will produce 10 this year in 2026, which is kind of a lot when you think about it. But the actual cost to go to that on a, run rate of 10 is that the Starship costs you roughly 41 million. And the total booster costs you 82 million. So you're getting exactly to these 120 million that I mentioned that the system costs you. If you fly it up, if you fly this system here up and you blow it up, you just wasted 120 million. But if you successfully deploy your cargo, you still was successful in transporting the cargo. So let's, for fun, just say 1. Okay, let's say 1. And here's the interesting thing. Even if you lose the booster and you lose the Starship, but you successfully carry your cargo to orbit because it has 150 tons, or no, you write it like an American, tons to orbit, you already dropped the price per kilogram to 892. That's not market price. That's, of course, internal price, right? You already achieved something tremendous without reusability, because that system is 10 times larger than the largest current system in terms of the cargo it can carry. And that is what most people get wrong. The reusability is nice and is very important for scale. But even without it, that system brings you the cost here. Okay, that is very good news. That is very good news for space AI, for transformation of the cost structure of space. And now we have to consider that the boosters already can be reused. I think we can safely assume 10, let's say. And then you bring down the costs dramatically. Look at this. Now you're talking about $397 per kilogram because you use the booster already 10 times. If you would use Starship 10 times too, that is totally not happening right now. But if you would, look at this. Look at the absolute transformation of the costs. Okay, that is the good news. And in my math, I did the math in November, very back of the napkin math. We will have much more accurate math. If you drop below $200 per kilogram, then 1 gigawatt data centers in space. Listen to what I'm going to say now. 1 gigawatt data centers in space will be 60% cheaper in total over a 10-year operating time than on Earth. Which means if you want to build mega centers, mega compute centers, mega data centers with GPUs and everything, you will save 60% of your entire cost and have no permitting problems if you use this system at $200 per kilogram. And here you would be already at 148. That is mind-boggling, and that's what everyone gets wrong. That is why this is so disruptive. That is why we have infinite demand for this, if this holds up. And even if Starship fails for another year to be reusable, we are still talking about only twice as much money. You're probably still, I have to do math on that number, on $400 per kilogram. That's probably already feasible. That's right, the threshold. I think $500 per kilogram or something. Market would be already the disruption point for AI in space. Let that sink in. We are basically already here. Now, let's get to today and why what happens today is actually much more important than Elon wants you to believe. Because Elon said, oh, forget about today. It's just a little test. If it blows up, we have 10 of these things. We can do it again and again. Well, here's the problem. Here's the problem. I told you the good news. Here's the bad news. We have something called insurance. And right now, you have to pay insurance per flight. Because if it blows up, you have to pay for the rocket and the cargo. Let's assume for a moment there's no insurance company and it's self-insured. SpaceX has to pay it. Forget insurance business. Think about just mathematically what happens if you have 10 flights and one blows up with cargo or without cargo, right? If it blows up, the other 9 flights have to carry that cost, okay? So if you lose $1 billion or something in one flight, and each other flight succeeds, you have to divide the $1 billion by the 10 flights or 9 flights that are remaining, and the 9 flights that are remaining need to increase their cost to cover that lost value. That is the insurance problem. That is literally the insurance problem. And that means there's a very simple equation here. Failures. What is the percentage of failures of flights? Now, let me be clear. This is not about if the booster blows up when it comes back or gets destroyed when it lands. This is not about if Starship, gets eviscerated when it re-enters the atmosphere and goes up, blows up in a ball of fire. That number is not the insurance number. That number is the reflight number, right? If you lose the booster on impact when it comes down, that's just a 1, right? You are basically then. If you lose the booster, if you can reuse the booster, let's say forever, or let's say you can reuse each booster 20 times, but every second time the booster gets destroyed, then you're basically using in average each booster 10 times. You get to that number, you understand. Then you get to $400 per kilogram. If you can use the average booster in average 20 times, you're getting to this number, right? You see how it works. And you also see that the number of times you reuse it is not that important. What's important is if you don't reuse it, it's at $892 per kilogram. But if you reuse it 10 times, it drops to $397. But if you reuse it 20 times, it doesn't drop much more because you're already very cheap on the booster. You gain it once you reuse Starship 10 times, then you have the second enormous drop. Okay, so that's how it works. The difference between reusing a booster 10 times and reusing it 100 times is actually a little more marginal than people think. So important is you want to reuse this thing at 10 to 20 times, then you're golden. The difference is between 1 and 10, of course, because you just divide the cost. Okay, let's get back to the insurance problem. There's a big problem, there's a big difference between losing the booster at re-entry or at re-landing or you losing the booster when it takes off. Why? If you're an astronaut, you know why. Because if this thing shoots you to the moon or wherever, you are on the moon and it lands on Earth and blows up, you say, too bad, send me another one. But if it blows up when you are getting transported to the moon, you're dead. That's a very big difference. So for the cargo, of course, it means the following. And now listen closely. Now I can't get to the important thing. If there is a real failure, if this thing blows up when it goes up, then you actually also lose the cargo. And that is very important because then you have an insurance problem. In my calculation, Space AI cargo at 150 tons, if you would actually transport GPUs and everything, is roughly $900 million, roughly $1 billion in cargo, and you would lose that. So if this thing actually explodes at launch, before Starship can go to orbit, before Starship reaches orbit, or if anything happens to Starship on the way to orbit, you have a real failure, right? So you can basically say at 10 launches, 2026, and you have one explosion at launch. Look what happens. Your cost just went up from $400 per kilogram to $1,000 per kilogram. Because now you have 3.8 million for fuel and other things, variable costs. You have booster costs of 11 million because you reuse it 10 times. You have Starship costs of 45 million, you don't reuse it. But now you get insurance costs of $100 million per launch. If you blow up twice in 10, this goes up to an unbelievable $409 million because now you only have 8 to cover for 2 blown up. And your dollar per kilogram goes to 3,000, 10x roughly, 9x from what it was before. In other words, once you understand the economics of the space situation, The question whether these things blow up or not, even with no cargo, because once you put cargo on, you have to take that into account. You have to look at the historic risk if it's the same version. If it's not the same version, you can't be sure, right? That's the problem. Then you will realize that reusability is only one factor. It's an important factor, but it pales in comparison with reliability. The reliability of the booster specifically and of Starship in every respect that is required to get the cargo to orbit. Not to reland Starship, but to not fail until the cargo is delivered. Opening the cargo door, for example. Very important. Starship doesn't need to blow up to fail. It just needs to fail to deliver the cargo. Because what are you going to do if it doesn't deliver? It hangs up there, you're screwed, right? Unless you get it safely back to Earth, but that's nearly impossible right now. So if you can't open the cargo door, you're probably not going to make it back to Earth. So that's what you guys have to watch out for, and that's what I'm watching out for. When you run the actual numbers and quantify that, reusability is fine, but reliability, in the sense of getting cargo to orbit, is much more important economically than reusability. Okay, and these are the two key factors to drive down costs. But one factor of all, reliability, much more important than reusability. And once you have reliability and control, reusability brings it down from 400. Well, let's do it like this. Let's get it back. Zero employees. You got it right. You had $890 at $900 per kilogram internal costs. If you create boosters, reusable boosters 20 times, you go down to 370 from 900. Then you go from 4,000 at 2 failures to 900. That's the big leap. Once you have no failures, from $900 per kilogram, you go with 20 booster reuses, which should be very soon to get to that number. You're dropping it from 900 to 370. And then if you boost the Starship reusability from nothing to 20, you are down to $100 per kilogram. So you can charge 200 and still get super rich as SpaceX. And then you open up space and everyone wins. So I hope that was a little bit of an insight how we have to think about these things. We have to break it down to numbers so we understand what are the key drivers of economics here. And it's a very simple takeaway for everyone who's interested in the IPO, in buying the stocks and understand the economics here. This is rocket science. And in rocket science, reliability, not blowing up your rocket at launch, is by far the number one rule. And even if you make it 10 times and the 11th times you blow it up, you still have a giant problem of $100 million in added insurance costs per launch, which dwarfs all other costs. Once you get reliability under control, which you never have under control, you have to make continuously sure you are not blowing up the rocket. Once you have that under control, it's all about reusability. Number one for the booster, because the booster is more expensive. And we got the booster. That is the news for Starship. And then for Starship itself. So all this hysteria about we need to make Starship reusable before anything goes here. Starship reusability is important, but it's actually the least important of the three things. Reliability is by far number one. Reusability of the booster is clearly the number two most important, and that has been already more or less solved. And then only number three is reusability of Starship, which is maybe the most complicated thing, but is also the least important economically. I'm not saying it's not important, but in my calculation, the odds that we can unlock space AI even without Starship reusability are actually high. That's why I'm very bullish strategically. But I'm, of course, tensed up about the question if this actually works and doesn't blow up. So this is why this launch is very important. I hope you enjoyed that. You should go to pioneerlands.org, by the way. Look at our beautiful updated site. This is still prototyped, but it works pretty well. We have the best news flow in the world when it comes to the Pioneer topics. Pioneer Lands Daily is a new system we developed. It's free, by the way. If you want to click later into analysis and research, then you need to be a citizen, but a lot of you are citizens of Pioneer Lands. And the idea here is we need to seize control of our own media so we actually get the news that we deserve. So we understand what's going on. This is not just politics. There's a little politics in here, but it's also about the tech trajectory, AGI, Tesla, SpaceX, and everything that actually matters for our lives. So go there. Of course, go to pioneeralpha.org too to see how we are doing in the investment side of things. But I hope that was interesting and see you very soon. And watch this all-decisive launch that is coming up today. I will be watching. Okay, see you very soon. We have more coming up tomorrow.